simply stood on stage, danced for 2 minutes, then spoke about their perceptions of us watching them. This Antino Segal's confessional participatory dance moment made me reflect yet again on dance as a metaphor for Documenta 13 slogan. The dance was very frenetic, lively, rattling, clanging, rolling, contorted, and lasts for a long time. This text comes closest to laying down the director's dense pattern of ideas in lieu of an irreducible curatorial concept. Perhaps there is an attempt on part of the documenter to free itself of any pulse-taking, new art now surveying obligation. Perhaps one of the ways in which I comprehend this allusion to dance is as a perpetual and creative shifting of identities and epistemologies. The notion of a frenetic dance that lasts forever could allude to a notion of social change and political and personal expression. This then immediately leads me to another popular allusion to dance in recent times in contemporary art, that in fact precedes Documenta 13, and I quote, "If I can't dance, I don't want to be part of your revolution." This is an ongoing project for the last since 2004. It originated in Belgium and has been taken on in Amsterdam, both as a performance relay, like a marathon project, and also a publication. "If I can't dance, I don't want to be part of your revolution" produces artworks and thematic, I've already spoken about this. The phrase, however, is a quote taken from Emma Goldman, a noted American feminist of Russian descent, who lived in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and who was lionized by her friends as a free-thinking rebel woman. The phrase for which Goldman has come to be known resonates with an analogy that was also very important to Nietzsche, whom Emma Goldman greatly admired. The allusion to dance, in both quotations, is to remain in a state of permanent conceptual and political motion. For Nietzsche, dance affirms becoming and the being of becoming. Nietzsche's most enthusiastic praise is reserved for books that teach how to dance and present the impossible as possible, as well as those that allow its readers to be able to dance on one's feet with concepts and with words. More than simply the physical embodiment of creative expression, dance alludes to the desire to remain in a state of permanent conceptual and political motion. It is unclear as to what the actual phrase really was, and here are a few options. "If I can't dance, this is not my revolution. If I can't dance, I don't want your revolution. If I can't dance, I don't want to be part of your revolution. A revolution without dancing is not a revolution worth having. If there won't be dancing at the revolution, I'm not coming." Now, without getting caught in the trap of the variation of the statement, I'd like to end with saying this: if I can't dance or don't want to dance, is it still my revolution? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sonia, for that performance, for that salvo fired in the ongoing battle between artists and curators, and also for being something that I can co-opt, because I can say you've done a fine piece of criticism and we should publish that somewhere. So all I can say now as we move along is, Jipesh, please come up and beat that.
Hello, everyone. I didn't want to speak, but Geeta insisted. Because Sabi has told him about some of my misgivings about the big exhibition called Documenta. But I just want you to recollect a day 10 years back, in 2002, because in the Documentas does create a kind of a unauthored, ungrounding force in it everywhere. So 2002, we were in the same panel here, and there was a very disquieting environment around the idea of what are the terms within which Documenta produces the idea of the artist, or who is brought into the art world. And it was a very disquieting, Gayatri was there, Geeta was there, and it was kind of thing, and that's why, Sonia, I don't agree with your idea of the survey show. Documenta is never a survey show, actually. And that was the misgiving that was produced. Never a service. Service. No, in the sense that there is a misgiving, and that produces the problem of reading it. And that's why I remember Roger Bruegel saying, I don't want to do a UNESCO show, and Catherine David, because they produced the idea of moving around and bringing people as a survey, which we know from 10 years back, that it was not a survey. That's why there was a disquiet. I just want to congratulate, that's why Ravi and Amar for hanging around for so long, for 10 years, to be back in the panel today. And I'm quite very proud of that, because it shows a certain way in which talking and thinking about art has emerged in the last 10 years. So that is the well done, friend. Now I want to just take one, because Geeta talked about this curator taking on the universal position and the artist taking on an I position. This framework is a very interesting framework, and this is something that I've been trying to figure out for a long time now. And one good essay is Foucault's position on the specific intellectual, where he talks about the demise of the universal intellectual, who can be called upon to talk on the universal idea of justice, and produce the amorphous subject who is going to transform the world, and to the idea of the specific intellectual. The specific intellectual who is there doing his work, dealing with what he calls the war and the battles of truth and power, and in a location produces a possibility of extending and exchanging the discoveries, investigations, and the resistances to the forms of power. Now, if you look at Foucault's essay, and I'm sure all of you must have been aware of, he takes a pharmacologist, a scientist, Robert Oppenheimer is very important. So there is an idea of a tenured position in the system. It's a 60, he's writing it in 74. There's an idea of a tenured fixed position in the system where you can do wars and battles to a certain way the system will play out to you over a period of time. But we know in the 80s and the 90s, that's why we need to revisit the idea of the intellectual. In the 80s and the 90s, that fixed position is no longer available. Even so-called the great American universities, we have 76% adjunct professors. And the ratio is going to be almost like 5% tenured and 95% adjunct in the next 15 years. So what you have is a different kind of mobility, a different kind of relationship between exclusion and inclusion, different forms of imbrication and implication in which you may not be aware of. But so we have to revisit the idea of what is the form of speech that we have to understand when an artist speaks and when we look at a curatorial speak. Because this is going to be, and see, art world is the edge of that form of labor. Artists are at the edge of the most untenured, it's kind of a fragile form of labor, where you can drop off the map very soon, or you can be, like what Foucault said, you can be brought into visibility that can take you off, shoot off you in a completely different direction. So I just kind of position this to, so in a lot of the loss of the affinity and collision in the I speak, in the many way the artist is produced, and the curatorial speak of the grand gesture movement, we need to revisit what is the other way we can look that can give us a different sense of affinities and collisions. One fascinating trait which we can think of is this, when the cosmonauts looks back to the Earth, and it's a very beautiful thing, and all the cosmonauts have said that it looks completely indifferent, Earth, moving in the cosmic void in an orbit, in a kind of surur, in an orbit, but it's stunning. So there is the reality that you have to face, which is this incredible indifference in terms of a cosmic void of your own Earth, and a great stunning presence of it. So this, I think, takes us to and that's why I've been trying to think this through, is that takes us away from an earlier reading of antagonism as a definitive idea of, it's based on the idea of interest. And I don't think with this realization of indifference and stunningness, one can have we are not totally aware of the idea of interest. So I don't think we have to drop the idea of an interest to a more collisionary idea of the world. So I'm trying to, I will come to why I'm thinking this in present of the document is produced. So this kind of framework. So now there is this idea of that there is no concept. Now this is something that a curator has proposed. Artists in the various way have worked within that proposition, may not be aware of that proposition, may not be even important for that proposition. And I think as any good, proper shows, they unground, they unauthor itself over a period of time, and it cannot be held back to what the curator has proposed, and it may not be also intelligent to hold it back to what the curator has proposed, because it moves. So what I spent about 3 days looking at it, tried to spend time. So I won't talk about any individual artwork, but I sensed a way of thinking about the world, history, philosophy that I found would be kind of, we need to inquire about it a little bit, investigate it, because it will have a bearing in the way we would narrate the relationship between aesthetic, creative, intellectual journey in the world and the way the world is shaped, the forces that shapes the world, the disjunction between the creative act and the forces of shaping the world. I think this is one. So I first take these 3 quotes from Adorno. Why Adorno? Because I think Adorno is deeply informing this document, and I think a conservative Adorno, a conservative reading of Adorno is there. But I don't, this is my Adorno that I mobilized, and I try to argue that there is, in Adorno, there is an internal disjunction, internal contradiction, and which he then has to, his beautiful book, Minima Moralis, is called From a Damaged Life. It's a different form. But there is in Adorno, I take these 3 quotes. Now, this is a quote that Benjamin writes in his Paris book. It's a small little note he gives to Adorno, which is, each epoch dreams of itself as annihilated by catastrophes. Now, this is 1935. So now this is obviously a rereading of kind of French historian Michelet's reading of, and you can find it in the web everywhere. It's not a rocket science to see this relationship between these texts. Basically, taking away the idea of dreaming and producing a world to annihilation by catastrophe as the way in which you remember. And look, this is 1935, rise of fascism. We know the context, but this is also the context the documenter refers to. Okay, but in Adorno there is another 2 compulsions. What are the other 2 compulsions? And he talks about, when he talks about education, what does he say? And this is a beautiful text, and I think needs to be understood in why there is an internal, why he's trapped, why it's a damaged life. The premier demand upon all education is that Auschwitz not happen again. But what is interesting is the next 2 lines. Its priority before any other requirement is such that I believe I need not and should not justify it. Now there is an imperative of, and I will need to justify why am I saying it should never happen in education. Now you take the idea of annihilated by catastrophe and take this imperative. They are in collision completely. They are not antagonistic. They cannot resolve itself. They are going to collide. And now this is, and then I will take you the 3rd position of this collision, which is where he says, which is now become a famous lecture by Judith Butler, where he says, wrong life cannot be lived rightly. And the wrong means the world under the ground in which you are living, which is exploitation, effacement, but can you live a just life, a good life? Now, see, these are the way he produces a conundrum. A conundrum is living through the world wars, living through Holocaust, living through 60s and 50s, recovery, transformation, GDP transformations. And this is, I think, this is a kind of a very contradictory force that is built in the way Adorno produces. But I think what happens in this documenta is that the catastrophe is taken very seriously. Now, and what is a catastrophe? Catastrophe is a misfortune, it is a calamity, and it's a turning over. Okay. And the catastrophe, what happens is that you start describing a catastrophe, and you start layering it out as the ground in which the world has to be thought. Now, there is an interesting thing. In 19th century, catastrophe, in Marx, there is a catastrophe. Marx is kind of scaring the bourgeoisie through the idea of the catastrophe. But there is progress and revolution. Okay. That is 19th century. 20th century, if you take Rosa Luxemburg, she, graveyard, catastrophe, crematorium, she remarks it. But it is infinity and revolution. The infinity of possibility, hated the petit bourgeois idea of spheres and orbits by which life could be understood. And it's an infinity and revolution. So there is a catastrophe always has to contend with other forces. And I don't know if there is a kind of a search for a way of thinking outside the catastrophe. Knowing very well you have to produce the catastrophe as the way to kind of ward off, in that sense. But I think post-70s, what happens, progress is beaten very badly as a conceptual framework. Its teleological structure is broken down. It's a new form. It's kind of fractured. Huh? You cannot really be saying progress good hai, or unless you are Montaigne or Monmouth, but that's too challenged. Within the cabinet also they challenge. They are nahi hai. But progress doesn't have that kind of intellectual. I can't produce an exhibition in the name of progress. You will beat me to death. So forget documenta. Revolution has got kind of, in a strange situation, appears, it disappears as a concept. So there is no, with coming of multitude, they have a completely different set of priorities than revolution. So now progress is gone, revolution is kind of upstaged. And I think one of the biggest problems, and this I share with Aral, that, revolution as a capture of power, producing the new sovereign, as the only ground of thinking the revolution has been a big problem of our political modernity. That revolution means only, it's the Zizek problem. Madam Thatcher also, but I want a Madam Thatcher with a red hat kind of problem. It's that problem that it needs the new creation of a new sovereign. So the other forms within which actually kind of what swarms of people transform the world is missing. So this continuous problem of revolution is to be seen as production of the new sovereign. Okay, sovereign will then enact a violence on the population and will destroy it. And revolution destroys its own child. That kind of formulation keeps away from us really thinking through this problem. So now we are left with catastrophe. Now my question with this document started that we are left with, we've given up progress, fine. We've given up revolution, fine. Now you're left with catastrophe. Okay. Now Oakvi moved it out. Oakvi started to, and it's in the heart of documenta. All the images, even Gita refers, Kavita refers, it's a kind of critical common sense of documenta, that it's a response to a catastrophe. But it is also a response to Cold War. It is also a response to regeneration of the world. But let's forget that. I'll come to that a little later. Now, the problem is, my question was saying, does catastrophe now seems to have a teleological structure? A teleological structure. Now, what I mean by that? Is the world being divided in catastrophe hierarchies, as progress did, within the idea that happened and happening? That the catastrophe has happened, and the catastrophe. And second, does this reorganize our perception of our own ways of looking at, other different ways of looking at history? Now, if you produce this idea of the catastrophe without the binding and a counter force, the countervailing force of revolution, progress, something like that, and it's let loose, what you have the problem is that does it map into the world in a way that progress is to map into the world? And I think we need to investigate this question, and not through just D15, D13, it is different form. So there is a world of catastrophe happening, which could then, like you said, Afghanistan is a larger thing. But why? Why we have to ask? So now this problem is that it's great that artwork, but if you start taking it as a metonymic for a larger thing, then we are in trouble. Then we are in trouble of producing a teleological structure within catastrophe, and where we get into a serious, it's a return of 19th century in a weird way. Now, why I say this is a problem. One thing that I've been looking at, trying to understand this problem, is the GDP. From the Documenta 11 to Documenta 13, the world GDP rose from 31 trillion to 70 trillion. So in these 10 years, human society has produced more than what they have produced in the last 100 years. Now, what did it show? Obviously, it's putting a huge strain on the very idea of energy, ecology, you can think it. Now, and this productive apparatus is you and I, as much part of, is the productive apparatus that produces the scaling up of the production apparatus. So, if you take this kind of scale up, doubling, 31 to 70, and remember, 70 GDP has to be produced every year. And in the newspaper, you can see every day 5%, 2%, 3%. Basically, 70 to nahi, abhi to 90 mein. That's kind of paranoia. And you know that, Buckminster for a long time back I said, you can't just hold this. You can't hold it. We are at least a tipping point or not tipping point. But is our reading of that situation through catastrophe takes us away from this huge productive machine that has been unleashed, or takes us closer to it? And does the teleological structure allows for us to get displaced by this question? Because the productive machinery now is very dispersed. It's very dispersed. Okay, now the second point. I have time, huh? No, I need 5 minutes. Because otherwise it look like I'm nuts. Look like I'm nuts. I just need. Yeah. Time lagaya. Because I told Gita that it will take time. Okay, now, see what happens. So what is the subjective response to a catastrophe? What kind of subjectivity is produced? So you will find a certain interest in hedonism, narcissism, in a certain kind of psychosis, certain form within which a kind of a blindness or a closure to death. And you will find that relation to subjectivity. And that actually now inhabits a large, you would see almost a kind of a political disjunction, megalomania, neurosis, these are produced. Because that is the subjective response to the idea of the catastrophe. And it has not been counter-voiced. So there is a sense of defeat, and it's almost like defeat and recovery is said like, Roj ho raha hai, nahi ho raha baba. It's like, no. So the problem is, if you're into that, then you are into a certain sense of subjective play. But there is also another thing that I found, which is in many works, and I couldn't name it, which is that a catastrophe could be an indeterminate end. Okay, so there is a disappearing aesthetics, so the catastrophe disappears. And so you have shards, distorted object shards, like fine. And things disappear, landscapes disappear, people disappear, so fine. This is the history too of Dipesh Chakraborty, in a grand scale, like, pehla one progress ho gaya, second one catastrophe. Bada aasan. But the problem with this is that the shroud and everything that is produced, there is in many works, there is this sense of indeterminacy of the catastrophe. And that is where the most interesting questions can come up, which is the very nature of matter is under question. So, the matter is no longer inert. Okay, the Fukushima classic is no longer inert. Matter is, so, but the rereading of matter as non-inert is coming through the catastrophe. So it is always a threat. But what is interesting is that you can actually have a completely different ontological situation of actually a kind of monist position where maybe Shankara finds a new good day in academia. And like a monist reading where the actually ontologically same position, we can say that everything is in a kind of dynamic movement. We are also matter, everything is matter, and the interspecies, intergalactic is all kind of within comprehension of a different form of ontology. But the thing is that I think that indeterminate position needs to be teased out and intellectually debated and not tied to an idea of catastrophe. And I think the biggest intellectual challenge of artists now, or intellectuals, is now you are no longer specific intellectual in the classic Foucauldian sense, unless you are maybe a JNU professor or something, but that is doubtful. But you are dealing with a very, very mobile attrition, highly, is that once you have disbanded a certain counter-narrative to this historical production of the catastrophe as the idea, and you are sitting on that huge production of surplus, an enormous production of surplus, 100 years, 200 years of human history has not even producing it. You know, World War II was fought in 50 billion GDP. Very small. And you are now in a tipping point of a completely different scale of operations. You know, drones in 1 year spends more money than World War II overall. You know, so you are in a completely different state. I'm just saying that if you continuously were not able to rethink these productive apparatus and just find a kind of a solace in this whole recovery thing, and recovery. And this document, there is this whole word for the healing. Nobody asks, what are you healing about? What are you healing? Intellectually, what are you healing? No. So, and healing to which state? You know, healing, I can understand. Ayurvedic mein jaake pair mein dard hua, healing ho. When you have this production, this cultural idea of the healing, and you do not actually want to discuss through the state, which state you produce this idea of healing, and this kind, I think, this healing, a therapeutic relationship to art and the world, and this idea of a subjectivity of paranoia, kind of hallucinatory, fear-driven idea, kind of fits into a strange idea, almost as if that other possible readings of inhabiting the world, other subjectivities have gone by. So you have dismantled, but what you have left with a residue and a theory that actually completely do away with any possible way of entering the 21st century. So one review said that this is the biggest, best art event of the 21st century. What was that? Stephen Madden, great review. And I think it is actually, finally we have an intellectual closure to the 20th century thing, because all the strands have exhausted itself. And now it is a chance for artists and intellectuals to ask, exactly after progress, catastrophe and revolution gone, what exactly is the new idea of acting and being in the world? And I think this document was for me a good experience of actually posing this problem for myself. Because for a long time I was seeing this happening, and there are a lot of other works which are actually grappling with this very interestingly in this document. I'm sure you will hear about them also. But the question is that in this meta-narrative of a grand scale, it finally locates Europe and North America where things have happened. The Creative Act can tell you, distributes again a new teleology which is happening, and then completely reties the world in a very old frames. Thank you. You talked about Jimmy Durham, okay, and you said that breeze and this referring back to the old moment of the catastrophe, taking out the history and putting it in public.
You're mixing up people, I didn't say that.
No, you said Jimmy Durham's work. Take your Jimmy Durham's work, which is a fantastic piece of work, and put it in the breeze of the Federalist drama. Jimmy Durham says that when did Europe become a continent? Where is the cut? And Paleolithic stone and this unused bullet produces a different history. You put it back into the breeze of history of the Federalist drama, you have a completely different reading of catastrophe. The thing is that we can actually redo those exhibitions, recut it, and produce a different, probably a different way of entering through artist works, through art, in collision of artist works, not through a kind of affirmation logic. Thank you.
And now Shuddho is going to grapple with the textual monument that was produced by Documenta 13. And as you can see, the unfolding catastrophe before us is a lunch that's going to be delayed by half an hour.
I'll try my best to not delay it further. Well, you know, Louis XV said, "Après moi le déluge," and I can only say before me was the catastrophe. I mean, that's the ongoing dialectic tension between Jivesh Bagchi and myself for 25 years. But in the notes that Geeta Kapoor sent to me to think about the text of Documenta, she also furnished an admonition: do not practice clairvoyance. And I wrote back to her saying, I cannot practice clairvoyance about things I have not seen. I see ghosts, so I talk about them. But if I have not seen a ghost, I can't talk about it. So therefore, I cannot talk about the work of art in the artworks in the Documenta. My brief is more modest and in some ways more difficult. It is to read a more than 800-page book. One of the reviews of the book says it is hernia-inducing. And that is not an exception, because Documenta tends to produce these volumes, and following Documenta, many other exhibitions now tend to produce volumes of great girth. And those, reading them, even for someone who is a certified insomniac like me, is not an easy proposition. And so I have tried my best to read as much as I can of the Documenta book of books, which, to be fair, is actually a collation of 101, actually, very finely produced, beautiful notebooks. And the notebook is a certain conceit that pervades the book of books, which I'll talk briefly about. And I think that it is unfair to think about the textual armature of Documenta 13 through this massive monolithic volume, whereas actually it can in some ways be more interestingly and productively engaged through a series of these notebooks, which can be assembled by the reader and in a sense self-curated by the reader in a far more agile fashion. And while I am quite excited, I mean, several of those notebooks are books that I would cherish having and reading over and over again. The prospect of reading the large volume fills me with intimidation. So the same object, which is a certain assembly of words and punctuation marks, acquires two very different sets of valences depending on the form that it takes. And I think that tells us something about the aesthetics of discursivity, which is a central problem of this Documenta's statement and presentation of itself. Now, before I move on, I'm a very increasingly an old-fashioned sort of person, and I tend to think in terms that are fairly antique by now. There are several figures of rhetorical speech. Those of you, I don't know if you study Aristotle on rhetoric over here. If you don't, you should. And amongst the rhetorical forms, there are three very distinguished ones. One is called apophasis and paralipsis, and it has a sort of cousin called occultatio. Apophasis, paralipsis are in Greek, occultatio is in Latin, and these are forms by which a speaker says, no, I will not mention so and so, right? I will not even talk about the fact that you have been so mean to me. So it's a way of invoking the presence of something by saying that you will not invoke its presence, right? And I find running through the textual carapace of Documenta 13 is this very old-fashioned rhetorical form, apophasis, paralipsis, and occultatio. There will not be a concept. And this is something that pervades, I mean, since I don't know the exhibition, I cannot talk about it, but I can certainly talk about a certain mass of discursivity that produces at its very central conceit a statement saying that all these words actually don't really have to amount to anything. I will not even invoke meaning while I impose on you an 800-page book. Now, thinking about that does allow me to think about one object that was supposed to be in the exhibition, and I'm not, I'm sticking by the homework that my teacher has given me, no clairvoyance. I'm not talking about an object that I have seen. In fact, I'm talking about an object that no one in Documenta has seen, although it was supposed to be there. And this is a meteorite, the El Chaco, which was supposed to occupy a central position in front of the Friedrichshain, which for various reasons that have partly to do with the realities of the political economy of logistics and shipment. Those of us who are artists know very well how much things cost. And the El Chaco is probably the heaviest single object on Earth. So even Documenta 13's budgets have constraints. But apart from that, there were complicated reasons of patrimony of the people in the part of Argentina and Patagonia, the very few remaining Native Americans in Argentina who said that this is not something that they would like to see travel. And in a very remarkable gesture, I think Caroline Christoph Bakagiev actually refers to the unfulfilled transit of the El Chaco as a kind of metaphor and analogy for the destiny of large exhibitions such as Documenta. So then think of documenta, not just this documenta, but all preceding and forthcoming documentas as meteorites from space that collide with the Earth and are arrested by that collision. El Chaco, incidentally, was arrested by being buried deep into the ground. It had to be excavated and then presented. So art, or the production of art, comes in a sense with a great velocity into the world, collides with it, submerges itself. The curatorial task is its excavation and its presentation. That, for me, is a very fascinating way of thinking about the non-object of documenta. What was it not about, which is what it was actually about, because it says it was about that which it was not about. There's a very interesting scientist whom I've been reading a lot called Gregory Bateson. He's a cybernetic theorist and mathematician who worked a lot with Humberto Maturana and was an early pioneering ecologist and worked on a book called Steps Towards a Concept of Mind. And to an ecology of mind. Steps towards an ecology of mind. There, Freudian slip. Think ecology, say concept. So steps towards an ecology of mind. And Gregory Bateson is a lurking figure within the text, because he is invoked in one of the most fascinating fragments of text in this book, a text by a writer, artist, curator, theorist, madman, shaman called Paul Ryan, and the text is on threeing. And 3 is a number that means a lot to me, because I'm part of a 3. And we've been thinking a lot about the valence of the number 3. And Paul Ryan in one of the notebooks, I think it's notebook number 13, actually talks about the significance of 3, of making that movement from self to other to the third. It's a concept that we've been thinking a lot about in terms of the third man and hallucinatory states when you climb mountains and see some third figure and so on. But lurking within Paul Ryan's text is the ghost of Gregory Bateson, in an unfulfilled long-term conversation with Gregory Bateson on cybernetic loops. What does information do when it comes back upon itself? Central problem of documenta. What do you do with a massive body of discursive formation of information which constantly reflects upon itself? Because as Geeta rightly pointed out, at least since Documenta 10, if not even in a slightly anticipatory mode since Documenta that Harold Zeman did, the figure of discourse and thinking is a central problematic for art making. Art looks back upon itself through discourse. Now, discourse on art is beginning to look back upon itself. So there's a series of sort of cascading cybernetic loops that seem to be occurring. This is a very interesting proposition because it seems to be producing a certain thickening or texturing of thinking about the making of art. There are 2 ways of responding to this. You can say that there's so many layers now that we don't actually have to make the effort of trying to slice through the layers and make different senses of it, find thin and thick modes of apprehending this. Or you can say, accept this for what it is, an incommensurable totality, and deal with it. That gives me back to Gregory Bateson, because in one of his very wry statements, Gregory Bateson once said, you cannot claim to have no epistemology. Epistemology is the science of how you know things, the philosophical practice of knowing what you know. So it's, what is known, what is not unknown, how do you know that we know these things? Those who so claim have nothing but a bad epistemology. And I think that the particular malady, not just of this document, and one should not be unfair to it, but of an overwhelming way in which the relationship that artistic practice and exhibition making makes now with discourse is the invocation of discourse without an epistemological anchorage, without the rigorous philosophical work that I think needs to be done when you invoke the act of thinking and speaking. So that a lot of people think and speak, a lot of words are said and written, an 800 page long book is produced, but in a sense, centered within that 800 page book is the vanity of saying that there is no concept, which means 2 things. If there is no claim to a concept, it cannot be challenged. So in a sense, it's like the teacher giving you the homework saying, go home and write everything. You can't do that. And you can't even challenge that statement. You can't even